I'm Eleanor Brennan, 51 years old, and I grew up a welder's daughter in a Gulf Coast port town before I spent 30 years at sea and earned the 2 silver stars of a rear admiral. For 3 decades, I gave the Navy everything I had, and the one person whose approval I wanted most still introduced me to the neighbors as the girl who does something with boats. But the day before I took command of an entire naval region, a young lieutenant ordered me out of the flag officer's mess, not knowing who I was, and the choice I made next changed how I carried all of it. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who you really were, or overlooked by the very person you spent your whole life trying to make proud? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you have ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. The night before they read my orders out loud, I stood in a hotel room 3 miles off base and ironed a khaki shirt that did not need ironing. It was already pressed. I had pressed it that morning. But my hands wanted something to do, and the iron gave them a reason. So I ran it slow over a collar that held 2 silver stars and tried not to look at the phone on the dresser. There was a message on it from my mother. I had not opened it yet. I knew what it would say more or less because for 30 years my mother had been saying versions of the same thing. And the message would be her trying one more time to get my father into a car and onto a base he had spent his whole life living beside without ever once stepping onto. My father was a welder. 30 years on the docks of a Gulf Coast port town, building the gray steel hulls that slid down the ways and out to the fleet, and in all that time he never understood why his only daughter looked at those ships and wanted to be on them instead of building them. To him, there were 2 kinds of people. There were people who worked, and there were people who watched other people work, and he had decided early that the Navy was full of the second kind. The town I grew up in smelled like cut steel and salt. The shipyard ran day and night, and the sound of it was the sound of my childhood, the clang and grind, and the long electric hiss of the arc. My father would come home with his forearms freckled by spark burns and his eyes red from the flash, and he would sit at the kitchen table and not say much, and that was love in our house. The not saying much, the going back the next day. When I was 10, he took me to the gate one Saturday because my mother had something at the church and there was nowhere else to put me. I sat on an overturned bucket and watched a destroyer ease out into the channel, and I could not breathe right for how much I wanted to be on it. I told him so. He kept welding. After a while, he flipped his hood up and looked at me and said, "You want to look at the water, look at it on your way to something useful." Then he flipped the hood back down and the arc lit up white. And that was the end of the conversation. You have to understand the world that raised me to understand why a sentence like that could follow a person for 50 years. The shipyard was a kingdom with its own laws. A man standing there was not a thing he claimed, it was a thing the other men granted, slowly by watching his welds hold and his shift record stay clean and his word turn out to be good. My father had standing. When he walked the yard, older men nodded at him and younger men straightened up, and I saw it as a girl, and I understood without being told that respect was something you earned in the body, with your hands over years in front of people who knew the work. What I did not understand yet was that there was more than one yard in the world, and more than one way to earn standing in it, and that the gray ships sliding out the channel were the gate to a different kingdom entirely, one my father would never set foot in, and would therefore never quite believe was real. My mother lived in the spaces around all of that. She kept the house and the budget and the church calendar and the long peace between a hard-headed man and a hard-headed girl who were, though neither would ever admit it, exactly alike. She was the one who noticed things. She noticed when I started checking out books about the Navy from the county library and reading them under the covers. She noticed when I memorized the silhouettes of warships, the way other girls memorized song lyrics. She never made a speech about it. She just started leaving the library's return dates circled on the kitchen calendar so I would not forget. A small, quiet conspiracy of 2. And she never told my father what the books were about. I was 18 when I told them about the scholarship. I had earned a Navy Reserve Officers Training Corps scholarship to a state university 400 miles north, full tuition, a path to a commission, and I stood in the living room and told them like it was a gift I was handing over. My father did not look up from the television. "College is for people who do not want to work," he said. My mother said nothing then. But 3 months later, she walked me to the bus station, and as the bus idled, she pressed a folded $20 bill into my hand and held onto my fingers a second longer than she needed to. "I kept the letter," she said. "The scholarship letter. I keep things." Then she let go, and I got on the bus, and I did not cry until we were past the county line. I want you to understand that my father was not a cruel man. He was a man with no language for the thing his daughter was becoming. The vocabulary he had was overtime and calluses and the trust of the men who worked beside him. And none of those words seemed to fit a girl who wanted to wear a uniform and give orders on a ship she did not weld. So he reached for the only words he had, and the words came out small, and they made me small, and for a long time I let them. There is a photograph on the dresser in that hotel room. I had brought it with me. It is from the year I was born, 1975, and it shows my father at the shipyard gate holding a baby in the crook of one arm. He is squinting into the sun, and so is the baby, the two of us making the same face at the same light, and I have carried that picture to every duty station I have ever had. It sat on a shelf in a stateroom, on a cruiser, and a destroyer, and in an amphibious assault ship and a flag cabin. And tomorrow it was going to sit on a shelf in the office of the officer in command of an entire naval region. And the man in the photograph still introduced me to the neighbors as my daughter. She does something with boats. I set the iron down. I picked up the phone. I put it back without reading the message. Tomorrow, I told myself. Whatever it says, deal with it tomorrow. What I did not know, standing there with a perfectly pressed shirt and a picture of a man who could not say he was proud of me, was that the next 20 hours were going to hand me a young lieutenant who had no idea who I was. A room full of admirals who thought my humiliation was entertainment and the smallest, truest apology I would ever receive. But that comes later. First, you have to understand how a person learns to stop waiting for a particular man to say a particular word. I learned it slowly. I learned it the way you learn most things that matter, which is to say, too late and at a cost. And I learned it from the people who said the word my father never could, long before I believed I had earned the right to hear it. My first ship taught me I belonged before my own family ever did. I reported aboard a guided missile cruiser in the fall of 1997, a brand new ensign, 22 years old, terrified and trying not to show it. The commanding officer was a commander named Roland Keyes, a lean, quiet man with a way of watching you that made you check your own work twice. Most of the junior officers were afraid of him. I was too, at first. Then one gray morning, we ran a man overboard drill in a heavy sea, and I was the junior officer of the watch, and I called the maneuvering board and the recovery without freezing, and afterward, he found me on the bridge wing. "You think 3 steps ahead," he said, looking out at the water and not at me, "and you do not panic." Then he did look at me. "The Navy is going to try to talk you out of staying," he said. "It talks everybody out of it eventually, the good ones especially. Do not let it." That was the first time a person with authority over me had told me in plain words that I belonged in the room I was standing in. I have never forgotten it. I have spent a career trying to be that voice for somebody else. The same year, I met Yvonne Castellano. We were 2 new ensigns thrown together at a training command, both of us a little out of place. And we recognized something in each other, the way you do when you are young and far from home and pretending to be sure of yourself. Yvonne became the family that fully understood me, the sister the Navy gave me to make up for the distance growing in the family I was born into. 30 years later, she would be standing next to me in dress whites the morning I took command. But I am getting ahead of myself again. Here is how the distance grew. In the year 2000, I made lieutenant, and I called home because I was 25 and still hoping. My father answered. "Lieutenant," I said. "I made lieutenant, Dad." There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Lieutenant, that is good money." And I stood in a phone bank on a pier with sailors moving their sea bags past me, and I felt the old smallness come back, and I said, "Yes, Dad, it is good money," because I had learned to translate my life into the only currency he counted. Not rank, not responsibility, not the 11 sailors I was responsible for, or the watch I stood over $1 billion of warship. Money. I gave him the number, and he said, "Well, all right then," and that was the call. It was not that I wanted my father to be a different man. I want to be careful about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as if I spent 30 years furious at him, and that is not the truth. The truth is gentler and harder. I wanted the man he actually was to look at the actual thing I had done and find it good. I did not want him to suddenly love the Navy. I wanted him to love that I loved it. Those are different hungers, and the second one is the one that does not go away, because you cannot argue your way to it, and you cannot earn your way to it. It is given, or it is withheld, and for most of my life it was withheld, not out of meanness, but out of a simple failure of imagination, the inability of a man to picture a world he had never been allowed inside. So I poured the hunger into the work, because the work would take it. Every watch I stood, every qualification I earned, every board I sat before and passed. I was building a case in a court where the one judge I wanted was not in attendance. I knew that even then. Yvonne used to tell me I was the most decorated person she knew who was still trying to win an argument with someone who was not arguing back. She was right. She was usually right. It is an annoying quality in a friend and an essential one. The years went by like that. I made lieutenant commander in 2004 and commander in 2009. And somewhere in there I stopped calling home with news, because the news always came back to me shrunken, and I got tired of watching it shrink. My mother filled the silence the only way she knew. She mailed clippings. Anytime my name appeared in a base newspaper or a hometown, paper picked up a promotion notice, she clipped it and mailed it to the ship, and I kept every one of them in a drawer in my stateroom, unopened mostly, because opening them hurt in a way I could not explain. She kept things. I kept the things she sent. Neither of us said what we were doing. Yvonne is the one who named it for me. It was 2009, the two of us newly minted commanders, standing on a pier in the evening with coffee going cold in our hands, and I was telling her about another flattened phone call, and she let me finish, and then she said the truest thing anyone ever said to me. "He is not going to wake up one day and get it, Ellie," she said. "You have to decide you are allowed to be proud without him." I did not answer her. I looked at the water, the way my father taught me, on my way to something useful. But the sentence went into me and stayed, and it took me the better part of 20 years to do what she said. I executed the job in front of me because the job was the one place the smallness could not reach me. I was executive officer of a guided missile destroyer in 2011 and commanding officer of one in 2013. And I will tell you that there is no room on the bridge of a warship in a crowded strait for a person who is busy feeling small. The ship does not care whose daughter you are. The sea does not grade on whether your father approves. Either you can do the job or you cannot, and I could, and the doing of it was the only argument that ever felt clean. Out there, I was not the girl on the bucket at the gate. I was the captain. The two things lived in the same body and never met. I made captain in 2015. In 2018, I took command of an amphibious assault ship, a big deck near 1,000 sailors and a marine element embarked, a small floating city, and that is where I first crossed paths with a senior chief named Hollis Ward, who ran the galleys and messes and fed every soul aboard 3 times a day in any sea. I did not know then how much that man had watched me. I did not know that a decade later he would be the first person in a room full of admirals to recognize the woman in the windbreaker, and that he would try to save a young lieutenant from himself, and that the lieutenant would not listen. But again, that is later. I made my star in 2023. Rear Admiral, lower half, 1 star, selected for flag, which is the Navy's way of saying the service has decided to trust you with more than a ship. I commanded an expeditionary strike group. In 2025, I pinned on my 2nd star. And in June of 2026, 51 years old, 3 decades after I sat on an overturned bucket and could not breathe for wanting, I was ordered to report as the commander of an entire naval region, the senior officer over the whole installation and every person on it, which is a long way of saying that the United States Navy had decided I was somebody, while the man in the photograph on my dresser still had not. I drove on to the base a day early. I want to explain why, because it matters for what happened. A change of command is a production. There are side boys, and a band, and a sword detail, and 100 small choreographed things. And from the moment you arrive as the incoming commander, you are surrounded, briefed, walked, saluted, handled. I knew that the next morning would swallow me whole. so I came in a day ahead, in plain service khakis with no fanfare. And I told my chief of staff I wanted 2 hours to myself to walk the base the way a sailor walks it and not the way an admiral is walked. I wanted one quiet meal before it all began. That is the entire crime I committed. I wanted a cup of coffee in peace. I found the flag officer's mess a little after 1300 hours. It is a quiet, wood-paneled room reserved for flag officers, admirals, and generals, the kind of place that exists on a large installation so the most senior people can eat without an audience. I was entitled to be there. I was, in fact, about to be the most senior person who ate there. But I had a light windbreaker on over my khakis against the hard chill of the air conditioning, and the windbreaker covered my collar, and so when I walked in and set my cover and a cup of coffee down on a corner table, what the room saw was a middle-aged woman it did not recognize in civilian-looking outerwear, sitting down in a space reserved for the elite. There were 4 or 5 flag officers scattered at other tables, none of them I had met yet. Behind the service line, a Master Chief looked up, and I watched his face change, and I knew him at once, even after 8 years. Hollis Ward, older, grayer, but the same steady eyes. He started toward my table with the look of a man who has just understood something the rest of the room has not. He did not get there first. A young lieutenant got there first. I had noticed him when I came in, a junior officer of maybe 28 standing near the entrance with a clipboard and the particular rigid eagerness of someone 3 weeks into a new assignment who has decided that the way to be noticed is to be the one who enforces the rules. He had been watching me since I sat down. Now he crossed the room and he stopped at my table, and he stood a little too straight, and he said the sentence that this entire story is built around. "Ma'am," he said, "this room is for flag officers only. You need to leave." I looked up at him. I was not angry. I want to be honest about that, because the story would be cleaner if I had been angry, but I was not. I was, more than anything, tired in an old and specific way. The way you get tired when a thing you have spent your whole life climbing out of reaches up and grabs your ankle one more time. So I gave him an out. I set down my coffee and I looked at him and I said, "Son, do you know who eats in this room?" He smirked. I will never forget that he smirked. "Admirals," he said, "not you." A couple of the seated flag officers glanced over. I watched them clock the situation, a young lieutenant correcting an unidentified woman, and I watched them decide it was entertainment. One of them, a rear admiral with a coffee and a newspaper, actually leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, settling in to watch the lieutenant handle it. He was smiling. They were all, in their small way, smiling. A room full of the most senior officers on the installation, content to sit and watch a junior officer evict a woman they assumed did not belong. Because it was a diversion, because it was a Tuesday, because no one wanted to be bothered to ask a question that might end the show. That was the part that went into me and stayed. Not the lieutenant, the smiling. The lieutenant, encouraged by his audience, got louder. He half turned and gestured toward the door, the way you would shoo someone, and he said something about how he was sure I had just gotten turned around looking for the visitor center. That was when Hollis Ward arrived at the table. "Lieutenant," Master Chief Ward said. His voice was low and flat and carried 30 years of authority. "Stand down," and the lieutenant, God help him, waved the Master Chief off. He actually lifted a hand and waved away a man with 30 years in the Navy, because in his 3 weeks of wisdom, he had decided that a lieutenant's judgment outranked a Master Chief's, and he said, "I have got this, Master Chief." He had no idea he had just argued with the only 2 people in that room who knew exactly what was about to happen. The door opened. My chief of staff walked in. Captain Dale Whitfield, a serious man in service khakis who had been looking for me to confirm a detail about the next morning. He took 2 steps into the room and he saw me at the corner table, and he came to attention so fast and so completely that the sound of it stopped every other sound in the mess. "Admiral Brennan," he said. "Ma'am, the change of command rehearsal is ready whenever you are." I have been in some quiet rooms. I have stood on a darkened bridge in a strait with every man holding his breath. I am not sure I have ever heard a silence as total as the one that fell over the flag officer's mess in the second after my chief of staff said my name and my rank. I stood up. I did not hurry. I reached up and I unzipped the windbreaker, and I let it fall open, and on each collar of my khaki shirt sat 2 silver stars, the stars of a rear admiral, upper half. The senior officer on the installation, the officer to whom every person in that room, including the rear admiral with the newspaper, and very much including the lieutenant with the clipboard, ultimately answered. The lieutenant's face did something I have only seen a few times in my life. The color went out of it all at once, the way water goes out of a sink. He looked at the stars, and he looked at my face, and he looked at Captain Whitfield standing at rigid attention, and the math finally arrived. "You," he said. His voice had gone to almost nothing. "You are the new admiral." The flag officers who had been smiling were not smiling anymore. The one with the crossed arms had uncrossed them and stood up. Across the room, a chair scraped as another rose. They had spent the last 90 seconds enjoying a show, and the show had turned out to star the woman who was going to command them, and now they were doing the urgent, internal accounting of people who have just been seen being unkind by the one person they most need to think well of them. I did not say anything to them. I did not say anything to the lieutenant. I picked up my coffee, and I took one slow sip, because it was a good cup of coffee, and I had come a long way for it. And I looked at the young man over the rim of the cup with something that was not anger. It was closer to curiosity. Because I knew that face. I had worn that face. Not the cruelty of it, but the terror under the cruelty. The need to prove you belong so badly that you will throw someone else out of the room to do it. I knew exactly where that came from. I had spent 51 years learning where that came from. Then I set the coffee down and I walked out with my chief of staff. And I left the lieutenant standing in the silence he had built, and the real story, the one that is not about a reveal but about what you do with one, began. In the corridor outside the mess, Dale Whitfield was quietly, controlledly furious on my behalf. He is a good chief of staff, which means he reads me well and he kept his voice level. But I could hear the steel in it. "Ma'am," he said, "do you want his name for the record? Say the word." "I have his name," I said. "It is on his uniform, the same as mine is on mine. I want his story first." Whitfield looked at me a moment, then nodded, the way a good officer nods when he does not fully understand the order but trusts the officer giving it. He had expected me to want the lieutenant destroyed. I think part of him wanted it for me. But I have been the person somebody wanted destroyed, and I have been the person who decided not to destroy them. And I can tell you that the second one is the only one that ever made me feel like the officer I wanted to be. Hollis Ward came out into the passageway a minute later. We stood there, the two of us, a master chief and an admiral who had last served together on a big deck 8 years before, and for a second, neither of us was a rank. "Admiral," he said, and there was a smile working at the corner of his mouth. "It has been a while." "It has, Master Chief," I said. And it had. And we both let that sit. Then he got to the point, because Master Chiefs always do. "That lieutenant," he said. "Pike. He is 3 weeks aboard. Good kid underneath it. Too much to prove, and nobody has shown him how to carry it yet." He paused, and then he said the thing that landed. "Reminds me of somebody, ma'am." He did not say who. He did not have to. He had watched me run his mess on that amphibious ship when I was younger and harder and carrying more to prove than I knew, and he was telling me gently that the lieutenant I had every right to flatten was a version of me. That night I called Yvonne. She's a captain now, stationed 2 time zones away, and she answered on the second ring the way she has for 30 years. I told her the whole thing, the windbreaker and the coffee and the smirk and the stars, and she laughed in the right places because it is, looked at from the proper distance, a little bit funny. But then I told her the part that was not funny. It was not the lieutenant, I said. He is 28 and stupid and scared. It was the admirals. They sat there and they smiled. They were going to let it happen for sport. She was quiet for a moment. "And 30 years ago," she said, "which one of them were you afraid you would become?" Leave it to Yvonne to find the bottom of it in one sentence. Because that was it exactly. I was not afraid I would become the lieutenant. I was afraid I had spent a career becoming one of the comfortable ones in the chairs, the ones who had climbed high enough that other people's smallness was a diversion instead of a wound. The reveal in the mess did not frighten me. The chairs frightened me. I thought about the lieutenant for a long time that night, longer than he deserved, and exactly as long as I needed to. Garrett Pike. 28 years old, 3 weeks into the most important assignment of his short career, and so frightened of being invisible that he had made himself the loudest object in a room full of admirals. I knew the mechanism of it intimately. because I had run on the same fuel once. When you come from a place where you were told you did not belong, you can spend your whole life overproving that you do, and the overproving curdles if no one catches it in time. It makes you officious. It makes you enforce rules you do not understand because enforcement feels like belonging. It makes you wave off the Master Chief, because if you admit he knows more than you, the whole brittle structure of your importance might come down. I had been lucky. A captain on a bridge wing had caught me before I curdled. No one had caught Pike yet. That was the difference between us, and it was an accident of mercy, not a difference of character, and I knew it, and that knowledge is the only reason I did not end him. There is a temptation, when you have spent your life being underestimated, to finally get power and use it the way it was used on you, to become the boot instead of the neck under it. I have watched good people make that turn. They get their star and they spend it settling scores, and they tell themselves it is justice, and it is only the old wound running the controls. I had promised myself a long time ago that I would not make that turn. The mess had just handed me the cleanest possible chance to break that promise. A lieutenant gift wrapped in his own arrogance, an audience that would have understood completely if I had destroyed him, which is exactly why I could not. The easy cruelty is never justice. It is just the wound, wearing a uniform, giving orders. I sat up late in my hotel room with the ceremony program for the next morning in my hands. There was my name, printed in full, the orders that would be read aloud, the choreography of becoming the commander of the region. And at the bottom of the seating chart, there was a line for 2 reserved seats in the front row, and the line was blank because I had reserved the seats and I did not know if anyone would sit in them. I picked up a notepad and I wrote one sentence on it, the sentence that decided everything I did the next day. Leave the room you wish you had walked into at 22. Then I turned off the light. In the morning I made 2 decisions and both of them cost me something. The first was about the lieutenant. I had him report to my office before the ceremony. He came in braced for the end of his career, standing so straight he was almost leaning backward, his face the gray of a man waiting for a verdict. I let him stand there a moment. Then I told him to sit, which surprised him, and I told him the truth. You enforced a rule you did not understand, I said, against a person you did not know, and you did it loud, in front of an audience, because the audience felt good. He started to speak, and I held up a hand. That is not the part that worries me, I said. Junior officers misjudge people. I misjudged plenty at your age. The part that worries me, Lieutenant, is that a Master Chief with 30 years in the Navy told you to stand down, and you waved him off. You decided your 3 weeks outranked his 30 years. If you do that again on this base, the person you wave off is going to be right about something that gets a sailor hurt, and your career will end for a reason that actually matters. This one I am going to let teach you instead. He tried to fall on his sword then. He tried to give me the resignation speech, the I have no excuse speech, and I stopped him, because a young man performing his own destruction is just one more kind of making it about himself. You do not owe me an apology, I told him. I outrank you. I will be fine. You owe Master Chief Ward an apology, because you embarrassed him in his own mess and he was trying to save you. Give him that. Then you are going to spend the next month learning this installation from the deck plates up, every shop and every watch and every galley, and you are going to learn the names of the people who actually run this base. And you are going to find out that almost none of them wear stars. That is the assignment. Do you understand it? Yes, ma'am, he said, and for the first time the rigidity went out of him and something honest came into his face. I think that was the moment he started becoming an officer. I want to say one more thing about that conversation with Pike because it is the hinge of the whole day and I do not want to rush past it. After I gave him the assignment, after the rigidity went out of him, he asked me a question I did not expect. He asked me why. Why are you doing this, ma'am, he said, instead of the other thing. He meant the career-ending letter, the thing he had walked in, expecting. And I told him the truth, because he had earned the truth by asking the hard version of the question instead of the comfortable one. Because someone did it for me once, I said. A long time ago, I was you, loud and scared in a room I was not sure I belonged in. And a man who could have flattened me decided to teach me instead. And I have spent 30 years trying to be worth that decision. You do not owe me anything for this, Lieutenant. You owe the next person. When you are standing where I am standing, and some terrified young officer hands you the perfect excuse to be cruel, you remember this morning, and you make the other choice. That is how you pay me back. That is the only way you can." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and I believed him, and I have rarely been more sure of anything. The second decision cost me more. I called home. My mother answered, and I could hear the hope in her voice, the careful, practiced hope of a woman who has spent decades trying to build a bridge between the two people she loves most. Then she put my father on. "Dad," I said, "tomorrow morning I am taking command of this whole base, the whole region. I would like you to be there. Not for me. So you finally see it." He did what he always does. He reached for the small words. He talked about the drive, 400 miles, his back, the traffic getting onto a base, whether they would even let him through the gate. I let him talk. I did not beg, because I had decided somewhere over the last 20 hours that I was done begging a man to be proud of me. "Okay, Dad," I said when he ran out of reasons. "The offer stands. The seats are reserved. I hope you come." And I let him hang up without saying yes. I called Yvonne, and I called Roland Keyes, my old captain, retired now, 3 stars when he left the Navy. They told me the same thing from different directions. "You already won the part that matters," Yvonne said. "You won it by becoming who you are. The seats are just furniture." And Keyes, in that dry, quiet voice that had told me on a bridge wing in '97 that I belonged, said, "I told you the Navy would try to talk you out of staying. You never let it. Tomorrow is just the paperwork catching up to the truth." Then he said, "I will be there, Eleanor. I am presiding. You asked me to, and I would not miss it." Which I had asked him to do because the man who first said I belonged should be the one to say it last. My father did not call back that night, but 12 minutes after I hung up with him, my mother sent a text. "I am working on him," it said. I kept the parking pass from the last time. She had kept the parking pass. Of course she had. She keeps things. The hours before a change of command stretch out strangely. There's a great deal to do, and most of it is not done by you. So you stand in the middle of a machine that is building your own moment, and you wait. I spent those hours watching other people change. Lieutenant Pike was on the quarterdeck before dawn. I know because Master Chief Ward told me later, with the particular satisfaction of a senior enlisted man watching a junior officer finally get it. Pike had found Ward in the dark before the sun was up and apologized, and not the cheap kind. He had stood there and owned it. And Ward, being Ward, had not let him off easy. "You want to make it right?" he told the lieutenant. "Learn 40 names by Friday. Real names, real jobs. Mine first." It was the same thing, almost word for word, that a captain had once done for a scared ensign on a bridge wing. The Navy is a long chain of people turning around and reaching back, and I got to watch a link form. One of the flag officers from the mess found me that morning, too. The rear admiral with the newspaper and the crossed arms. He came up to me before the ceremony with a stiff, careful expression and offered something that was about 40% apology and 60% damage control. He had not meant anything by it, he said. It had all happened so fast, surely I understood. I let him off, but I let him off with grace and no warmth, which he felt because the men who watch for sport are suddenly very interested in being remembered as kind once the person they watch turns out to outrank them. I filed it away, not as a grudge, as information. You learn who people are when they think the cost is zero. I thought about those chairs more than an admiral should admit. All through the morning, while aides briefed me on the order of events, and a yeoman adjusted the fall of my dress uniform, and the band ran its sound check somewhere outside, part of me was sitting in a parking lot 400 miles south, watching a man decide whether to get in a truck. I had told myself I was done begging for his approval, and I meant it. And it was still true that I wanted him there so badly it had a physical weight, low in the chest, the exact place the smallness used to live. Those two things are allowed to be true at once. You can stop needing a person's approval to function and still want their presence with your whole heart. Maturity is not the death of the longing. It is learning to carry the longing without letting it drive. Master Chief Ward found me for a moment in the middle of all that motion. He did not have a reason, officially. He just appeared at my elbow the way senior enlisted men do when they sense an officer needs ballast, and he said quietly, "Big day, ma'am." And I said it was, and he said, "You have had bigger. You just did not know it at the time." Then he was gone again, back to running the only thing he would ever consent to run, which was everything, from the shadows, where the real work is always done. I have been carried by Master Chiefs my entire career. People think admirals run the Navy. Admirals decide things. Master Chiefs run the Navy. Any honest flag officer will tell you the same. I went to the ceremony venue at sunrise before anyone was there, because I wanted to see it empty once. The chairs were set in their long ranks, the bunting was hung, the podium stood waiting. And in the front row were 2 chairs with reserved cards on them, and the chairs were empty, and I stood and looked at them for a while in the gray early light. I am not going to pretend that was easy. I had told my father the seats were not for me, that I wanted him there so he could see it, and that was true. But it was also true that the 18-year-old on the bus and the 10-year-old on the bucket were both still in me, and both of them were looking at those 2 empty chairs. Yvonne found me there. She had flown in the night before, and she came into that empty venue in her dress whites, my oldest friend. And she stood next to me and looked at the 2 empty chairs and did not say anything sentimental, because she knows me. "Whoever shows up," she said finally, "you walk in here at 1000 and you take the base. That is the deal you made with 18-year-old you. You do not get to renegotiate it now because you are scared." I laughed, because she was right, and because being known like that is its own kind of home. Then from outside, I heard a car I did not recognize pull into the visitor lot, and I could not see who was inside it, and I made myself turn away and go put on my dress uniform, because an admiral does not stand in a window watching a parking lot, no matter whose daughter she is. It was my mother's doing in the end. Of course it was. She got him in the car. She told me later that he had turned the truck around twice in the driveway, 2 separate times put it in reverse and backed out and then stopped and pulled back in. And the 3rd time she simply walked around to the driver's side and made him move over, and she drove. 400 miles. She drove my father to watch me take command because he could not quite drive himself, and that is the most honest picture of my parents' marriage I will ever have. I did not see them arrive. I was being prepared, surrounded by aides and the choreography of the morning. But Hollis Ward saw the name Brennan on the guest list, and Hollis Ward, being who he is, left his post and went and found an old man in his one good shirt, standing lost at the edge of a world he did not understand, and the Master Chief walked my father in personally. And on the way, Ward told my father something I never could have told him, because it would have sounded like bragging coming from me, but coming from a Master Chief with 30 years in it sounded like the gospel truth. "Your daughter," Ward said to my father, "ran the toughest mess afloat, fair to every single sailor on it. I watched men twice her size do exactly what she said because they trusted her to be right and to be fair. I served under a lot of officers. I would have followed her anywhere. I was one of her sailors, sir, and I am proud of it." My father did not have words for ships or rank or command, but fairness he understood. The trust of working men he understood. That was the entire economy of his life, the docks where a man was measured by whether the men beside him trusted him to do the work right. Ward had handed my father a translation, the only one that would ever reach him, and I will be grateful to that man until the day I die. I had 3 minutes with my father before the ceremony. They brought him to a small room off the main floor and left us alone. And there he was, my dad, 78 years old, a welder in his one good shirt, turning the printed program over and over in his scarred hands, the way he used to turn a part he was checking for flaws. He did not look at me at first. He looked at the program, and then he said, very quietly, in a voice I had never heard him use, "I did not know it was a whole base." "I know, Dad," I said. That was all. That was the entire conversation. I did not give him a speech about 30 years of small words. He did not give me one about being sorry. He said he did not know it was a whole base, which was his way of saying that the thing his daughter had become was vastly larger than the small place he had filed her in. And I said I know, which was my way of saying I forgive you. And 3 minutes later they came to get me. Sometimes the whole reconciliation is 2 sentences. Sometimes that is all there is room for, and it is enough. He sat in the reserved chair in the front row, my father, and he held the program with both hands the way he once held tools. Lieutenant Pike, I found out afterward, was the one who made sure the Brennans had the best seats and a program in good condition and water on a hot morning. The young man who had tried to throw the Admiral out of the mess spent the morning quietly serving the Admiral's family. He had learned the assignment faster than I expected. He was going to be a fine officer. I was almost sure of it now. At 1000 hours, the ceremony began. Vice Admiral Roland Keyes, retired, 3 stars, my first captain, stood at the podium as the presiding officer. And before he read a single line of the official orders, he looked out at the assembly and he said this: "I have known the officer we are here to honor since she was a 22-year-old ensign on my ship who refused, absolutely refused, to be talked out of her own future. I told her once that the Navy would try to talk her out of staying. It tries that with all the good ones. She never let it. So before we make this official, I want it said out loud, in front of everyone, that this day is not a surprise to anyone who is paying attention. It is the most predictable thing in the world, and it just took the paperwork a while to catch up. I kept my composure, because you do, because you are about to assume command, and the whole room is watching, and an admiral does not weep at her own change of command. But I want to tell you what it is to have the first man who ever said you belonged stand up 30 years later and say it again to a room full of people, while your father, who never could, sits 10 feet away and hears it. There are not words for that. There are only stars on a collar and a program held in 2 scarred hands. I have thought about why a change of command moves people who have no stake in it, and I think it is because the ceremony is built to say a thing out loud that we usually leave unsaid, which is that a person's life of work has weighed something. The Navy does not do this casually. It pipes you aboard. It posts side boys. It reads your orders in full, every line, the whole official sentence of your career, in front of an assembly that has to stand and witness it. There is a deliberate, almost stubborn formality to it, and the formality is the point. It is the institution turning its hood up and looking at you instead of the water. For a girl who grew up in a kingdom where standing was granted slowly and only in front of people who knew the work, there is no ceremony on earth better designed to reach the place in me that needed reaching. My father had spent his life in a world that granted respect exactly that way. He just had never seen my world do it. Now he was watching it happen, in full, with his daughter at the center of the formality, and I could see on his face the moment he recognized the grammar of it, the slow public granting of standing, because it was the same grammar as the docks, only the kingdom was larger than he had ever let himself imagine. They read the orders, the detachment of the previous commander, the reading of my orders, the formal transfer, the long ritual the Navy uses to mark the passing of responsibility from one set of shoulders to another. I assumed command of the region. Side boys, the boatswain's pipe, the salutes. And when it was done, when I stood there as the commander of the entire installation, the flag officers who had watched a lieutenant try to evict me from a coffee 20 hours earlier rose and saluted, every one of them, including the rear admiral with the newspaper. And I returned the salute with a face that gave away nothing, and I thought, you will never again be sure who anyone is in a room. Good, neither was I at your age. Carry it. I gave my remarks. They were short. I have sat through enough long ones to know mercy. I talked about who actually runs an installation, the chiefs and the lieutenants and the civilians and the families, the people whose names are not on any building. I talked about the men and women who build the ships and the ones who sail them, and how a navy needs both and respects both. I never once said the word father. I never named him. But I said all of it, looking at the front row, at an old welder holding a program in 2 hands. And he knew, and I knew. And that was the only audience for those particular sentences. And then the ceremony was over, and the crowd began to thin, and the only thing in the world I wanted to do was walk down off that podium and go sit next to my dad. We sat on 2 folding chairs in the emptying venue, my father and I, while the staff broke down the bunting and stacked the rows around us. He still had the program in his hands. For a while he did not say anything, and I let him not say anything, because I have learned that my father's silences are not empty, they are just slow. Your grandfather, he said finally, welded the hull of a ship like one of those, down on the Gulf before I was born. And then I welded the next generation of them, 30 years of them. He turned the program over. I thought that was as close to the Navy as a Brennan got. I thought we built them and other people drove them, and that was the order of things. He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet, which I had seen exactly twice in my life. I did not know one of us could end up running the whole thing. You built the ships, Dad, I said. I just learned to drive them. It is the same Navy. We were always in it. We were always in it, both of us. The welders and the sailors, 2 ends of the same long thing. He nodded slowly. And then my father, who had spent 51 years unable to say he was proud of me, said the closest thing to it that he had in him. "I should have kept the letters too," he said. "Like your mother. She kept every one of them, every clipping, every notice. She kept the scholarship letter for 30 years. I told her she was wasting the drawer space." He shook his head. "She was right. She's always right. I should have kept them too. I have replayed those words more times than I can count, and every time I find something new folded inside them." He did not say, "I am proud of you," because those were not words my father owned. But he said, "I should have kept the letters too," and inside that sentence was an entire confession. It meant he understood now that there had been letters worth keeping, milestones worth marking, a record worth preserving, and that my mother had been right to preserve it, and he had been wrong to call it a waste of a drawer. It meant he had spent 30 years filing his daughter under something too small, and he knew it now, and this was him saying so in the only dialect he spoke. People who grew up in homes with easy words sometimes do not understand that a sentence like that, from a man like that, is worth more than 100 fluent declarations from someone for whom they cost nothing. The price of a thing is part of its meaning. That apology cost my father everything he had, every brick of the wall he had built around never being wrong about me, and he paid it on a folding chair in an emptying room, and I would not trade it for the most eloquent speech ever given. That was the apology. I should have kept the letters too. It does not look like much written down, but I had waited my whole life for it, and when it came, I found that it was exactly the right size, because it was true, and it was his, in his own language, and a grand speech would have been a stranger's speech. I reached over, and I put my hand on his scarred welder's hand, and we sat there, and neither of us said anything else. And it was the best conversation we ever had. The threads of that day tied themselves off, one by one. Lieutenant Pike sent word through Master Chief Ward that he had learned his 40 names by Wednesday, 2 days early, and Ward told me this with the pride of a man who has successfully reached back down the chain and pulled someone up. Keyes shook my father's hand on the way out, an admiral and a welder. 3 stars and 30 years on the docks. 2 old men who had spent their lives serving the same navy from opposite ends and who recognized each other instantly as workers. Yvonne hugged me hard and long and did not say anything, because everything had already been said over 30 years of cold coffee on 100 piers. And my mother, last of all, came and put a worn folder in my hands, thick and soft-cornered, and inside it was every clipping she had ever mailed me, and the ones I never saw, and on top of them all, kept flat and perfect for 33 years, was the scholarship letter. "I keep things," she said. "I told you that. I have always kept things." I drove my parents to their hotel that evening myself, in my own car, no aide, no detail, just the 3 of us. And my father sat in the front and looked out the window at the base going by, the piers and the cranes and the gray ships nested along the waterfront, and he did not say much, which was him at peace and not him withholding. At a stoplight, he reached over and tapped the window glass toward a destroyer tied up across the channel. "That one of mine," he said, meaning his yard had built it years ago, far away, before it ever wore that hull number. "Could be, Dad," I said. "Probably is." And he nodded, satisfied, a welder and an admiral idling at a red light beside a ship that one of them had built and the other now commanded. And for the length of that stoplight, there was no distance between us at all. So here's what I know now, after all of it. I know that the lieutenant who tried to throw me out of that room is going to be a good officer, maybe a fine one, because the worst thing he ever did happened early, and to someone who chose to teach him instead of end him. I know that the men who smiled in the chairs taught me more about the admiral I do not want to become than any course ever did. And I know that the medals and the stars and the command of an entire region were never actually the thing I was reaching for. The thing I was reaching for was a man in a welder's shirt, finally turning his hood up, looking at me instead of the water and seeing that I had gone to something useful after all. If you are out there waiting for a particular person to say a particular word, the one whose approval you pretend you stopped needing a long time ago, I want to tell you 2 things. The first is that you may have to become the whole person you're going to be without ever hearing it, and you have to decide, the way my friend told me to decide on a pier 30 years ago, that you are allowed to be proud without them. And the second is that sometimes if you stop waiting and just go become the thing, they catch up. Not always. But sometimes a man turns the truck around twice and then lets your mother drive him 400 miles and sits in a folding chair and says he should have kept the letters too. I folded the program small and put it in my breast pocket, the same pocket as my stars. Then I walked out of that venue and into the parking lot, into the same Gulf sun I had squinted into as a child on an overturned bucket at the shipyard gate. On my way, finally, all the way, to something useful. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. If you have ever poured your whole life into work that the people closest to you could not quite see, I would love to hear about it. Did you have a Master Chief Ward in your life? Someone who once said the kind, true thing about you that you could never manage to say about yourself? Did you ever finally get the small, late, honest apology you had stopped waiting for? The way I got mine on a folding chair in an emptying room? And if you had been in my place in that mess, with the perfect excuse to end a young officer's career, do you think you could have chosen to teach him instead? Tell me in the comments. I read them. And if this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while.